The autumn breeze carried a hint of winter as David Wilson walked across Harvard's historic campus, his footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. His daughter Tanya walked beside him, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the grand buildings that seemed to breathe with centuries of knowledge. At 16, Tanya was already dreaming of walking these paths as a student, her mind naturally drawn to numbers and equations in a way that sometimes left David in awe. "Dad, can we check out the math department before the official tour starts?" "We have like 40 minutes, Tanya asked, checking her watch. The excitement in her voice was something David couldn't resist. "Sure thing, kiddo. Lead the way," he replied with a smile. His daughter had mapped out every building she wanted to see weeks before their trip from Philadelphia. David had taken a rare day off from his job as an electrical engineer at a power company to make this campus visit happen. As they walked toward the mathematics building, David thought about how much his daughter reminded him of himself at her age. Curious, determined, and in love with the elegant language of mathematics. But unlike him, Tanya would have every opportunity to pursue her dreams. That's what he had worked so hard for all these years. The mathematics building stood like a temple of knowledge, its brick facade weathered by time. Inside, the halls were quieter than David expected, with only the occasional student hurrying past with books clutched to their chest or professors deep in conversation about things beyond most people's understanding. "Look, Dad," Tanya whispered, pointing to a classroom door left ajar. Through the gap, they could see a large lecture hall where a class was in progress. "That's differential equations. Can we just peek in for a minute?" David hesitated. "We shouldn't interrupt, please?" "Just for a minute," Tanya pleaded. "We'll sit in the back. No one will even notice." Against his better judgment, David nodded and they slipped into the lecture hall as quietly as they could. They found seats in the back row, hoping to observe without drawing attention. The lecture hall was filled with about 60 students, most typing frantically on laptops or scribbling notes as they tried to keep up with the professor. At the front of the room stood a tall, thin man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Professor Richard Thompson, according to the name written on the board, moved with an energy that belied his age as he filled the massive blackboard with equations. "This is so cool," Tanya whispered, her eyes fixed on the complex mathematics being written out before them. David smiled, watching his daughter more than the professor. In that moment, he could see her future unfolding, the late nights studying, the breakthroughs, the contributions she might one day make to a field he had only dabbled in. His own journey had taken a different turn when Tanya's mother had passed away unexpectedly when Tanya was just 7. Career ambitions had given way to the more immediate needs of raising a daughter on his own. "And this," Professor Thompson was saying, his chalk tapping against a particularly dense section of the board, "is where most attempts at solving this class of equations break down." David found himself drawn into the lecture despite his intention to merely observe. The professor was discussing an approach to solving nonlinear differential equations that David had read about in a journal article just last month. He leaned forward slightly, his engineer's mind automatically processing the mathematics, finding the familiar patterns and noting the novel approaches. "Now, can anyone tell me where the traditional Meyer method fails when applied to this particular problem?" Professor Thompson asked, scanning the room with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Those eyes eventually landed on David and Tanya in the back row, and the professor paused mid-sentence. The entire class turned to see what had caught his attention. "It appears we have visitors," Professor Thompson announced, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet hall. "Welcome to Advanced Differential Equations 501. David felt heat rising to his face as 60 pairs of eyes focused on them. "I'm sorry, Professor. We're just visiting the campus. My daughter is interested in mathematics. We didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all," Professor Thompson replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "In fact, your timing is perfect. We were just discussing a particularly challenging concept." He paused, studying David with an expression that made David shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Perhaps our guests would like to share their thoughts?" David could feel Tanya tense beside him. This wasn't what they had planned. "We're just here to observe," David said politely. "Please continue with your class." But Professor Thompson was already walking up the aisle toward them, chalk still in hand.
"Nonsense."
"There's no better way to understand Harvard's approach than to engage with it directly." He stopped at their row. "What's your name, sir?" "David Wilson," he answered, wishing he'd chosen a different building to explore. And what do you do, Mr. Wilson? I'm an electrical engineer. I work for Power Grid Solutions in Philadelphia. Something flickered across the professor's face. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe disappointment. An engineer, interesting. And the young lady? My daughter Tanya, she's a junior in high school. She's hoping to study mathematics here in a couple of years. Professor Thompson's expression softened slightly as he looked at Tanya. A future mathematician. Excellent. Well, Mr. Wilson, as an engineer, you must have some familiarity with differential equations. Some, David admitted modestly. In truth, he used them daily in his work with power grid systems, but this wasn't the time or place to elaborate on his credentials. Wonderful. Professor Thompson clapped his hands together once, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Then perhaps you wouldn't mind coming down and offering your perspective on our problem. The students stirred, some exchanging glances, others looking uncomfortable. David realized with a sinking feeling that the professor was challenging him, perhaps even setting him up to fail in front of his daughter. I don't think that would be appropriate, David said, trying to maintain his composure. We're not enrolled students. Consider it a demonstration for your daughter of what she might encounter as a Harvard student, Professor Thompson insisted. A taste of the real Harvard experience. David looked at Tanya, whose expression had shifted from embarrassment to something like determination. She gave him a small nod, her eyes saying what her voice didn't. Show them what you can do, Dad. In that moment, David realized he was at a crossroads. He could politely decline again and leave with his dignity intact, but possibly reinforce whatever assumptions the professor had already made about him. Or he could accept the challenge and risk public failure in front of his daughter and a room full of Ivy League students. He thought of the late nights at the kitchen table, helping Tanya with her advanced math homework, while also quietly working on his own mathematical puzzles that had nothing to do with his day job. He thought of the online forums where he discussed theoretical problems under a username that gave no hint of his background or education. With a deep breath, David stood up. All right, Professor. I'd be happy to take a look. Surprise flickered across Professor Thompson's face, quickly replaced by a polite smile. Excellent. Please come down to the board. As David made his way down the steps to the front of the lecture hall, he could feel the eyes of every student on him. Some looked curious, others amused. A few seemed embarrassed by their professor's behavior. Tanya gave him a thumbs up as he passed, her face a mixture of worry and pride. David winked at her, drawing on a confidence he didn't entirely feel. At the board, Professor Thompson handed David a piece of chalk. The problem is outlined here, he said, pointing to a section of the board covered in dense mathematical notation. We're looking at a particularly stubborn form of the Navier-Stokes equation as applied to turbulent flow in non-uniform fields. David studied the equations, letting his mind settle into the familiar rhythm of mathematical thinking. The problem was indeed complex, far beyond the day-to-day applications he dealt with at work. But it wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Take your time, Professor Thompson said, his tone suggesting he expected David to hand the chalk back at any moment and admit defeat. Instead, David rolled the chalk between his fingers, his mind already breaking the problem into manageable pieces. Behind him, he could hear the shuffle of papers and the occasional whisper among the students. But as he focused on the equations before him, those sounds faded away. In that moment, there was only the problem, the chalk, and the quiet voice in his head that had never stopped loving the pure beauty of mathematics, even when life had pulled him in a different direction. With a steadying breath, David raised the chalk to the board and began to write. The lecture hall fell into complete silence as David stood at the blackboard, chalk in hand. Professor Thompson had stepped back, arms folded across his chest, watching with an expression that mixed curiosity with undisguised skepticism. The equation sprawled across the board in white chalk, a monster of symbols, Greek letters, and nested parentheses that would have intimidated most people. David could feel sweat forming on his brow, not from the mathematics, but from the 60 pairs of eyes locked on his back. He hadn't stood before a crowd like this since college. His fingers tightened around the chalk, leaving dusty white prints on his palm. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Wilson, Professor Thompson said, glancing at his watch. The implication was clear. He didn't expect this to take long. David took a deep breath and studied the equation again. It was a variation of the Navier-Stokes problem, one of the famous unsolved challenges in mathematics. Not the full problem. That would be unreasonable even for a Harvard graduate class, but a specialized case dealing with turbulent flow patterns. Complex enough to be challenging, specific enough to be potentially solvable. This is an interesting approach, David said, pointing to a section of the equation. You're using Kaplan's transformation on the left side. Professor Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that David had recognized the technique. Yes, that's correct. Are you familiar with Kaplan's work? I've read some of his papers, David replied, deliberately understating his knowledge. The truth was he'd spent countless evening hours over the past 15 years reading advanced mathematics journals, working through problems just for the pure joy of it. Long after Tanya had gone to bed, a student in the front row whispered something to his neighbor, and a few chuckles rippled through the room. David ignored them, focusing instead on the problem before him. He had spotted something, an inefficiency in the approach, perhaps even a flaw. Professor, I notice you're trying to solve this directly, David said carefully. But what if we approach it from a different angle? By all means, Thompson replied, his tone suggesting he was humoring David. Show us this. Different angle. David erased a portion of the board and began writing. His chalk moved confidently now, filling the space with his own neat handwriting. He started by transforming the equation, breaking it down into components that could be analyzed separately. If we treat the turbulent flow as a superposition of laminar flows with varying boundary conditions, he explained as he wrote, we can apply Chen's theorem to each component independently. He was vaguely aware of murmurs spreading through the classroom. A few students were typing rapidly on their laptops, perhaps looking up Chen's theorem, while others leaned forward in their seats. Professor Thompson's expression had shifted from polite skepticism to genuine attention. Chen's theorem isn't typically applied to fluid dynamics problems, he commented. Not directly, David agreed. But if we make this substitution here, he wrote out a complex transformation. It allows us to reframe the problem in terms that Chen's approach can handle. As he worked, David felt a familiar sensation washing over him, that peculiar clarity that came when he was deep in mathematical thought. When the world narrowed to just the problem at hand, it was like meditation, or what he imagined meditation might be. In these moments, his mind felt most alive, most himself. He filled nearly half the board with careful derivations, each step building logically from the last. His background in electrical engineering gave him a perspective that pure mathematicians sometimes lacked, a practical understanding of how theoretical concepts manifested in physical systems. He wasn't just manipulating symbols. He was envisioning the actual flow of fluids, the dance of particles, the transfer of energy. 10 minutes passed in near silence. David paused occasionally to check his work, aware that a single error could invalidate everything that followed. Behind him, he could hear the occasional rustle of paper, the tapping of computer keys, the soft hum of the building's air conditioning. This approach, Professor Thompson said finally, breaking the silence, is unorthodox. David turned to face him. Sometimes the conventional approach isn't the most efficient. Indeed, Thompson replied, studying the board with narrowed eyes. Continue. David turned back to the board. He was approaching a critical juncture in the solution, a point where he would need to make a conceptual leap that wasn't immediately obvious from the standard literature. The key insight, he explained, writing as he spoke, is that the turbulence pattern here isn't truly chaotic. There's an underlying structure that emerges when viewed through the right mathematical lens. A student in the middle of the room raised her hand. But Kolmogorov's theory states that turbulence is fundamentally unpredictable beyond certain scales. David nodded, appreciating the thoughtful challenge. That's the conventional view, yes. But recent work by Rodriguez and Parks suggests that certain classes of turbulent systems retain predictable structures even at very small scales. If this problem falls into that category, and I believe it does, then we can use that structure as a foothold. The student looked impressed, jotting something in her notebook. Professor Thompson was watching David with an intensity that suggested he was reassessing his initial judgments. Rodriguez and Parks' work is very recent. It's not yet widely accepted in the field. True, David acknowledged, but their experimental results are compelling. and their theoretical framework offers a way forward for this particular problem. He turned back to the board, continuing his derivation. The mathematics was becoming more complex now, the expressions more unwieldy. Twice he had to erase portions of his work to make space for new developments. Once he paused for nearly a minute, staring at the board while he worked through a particularly tricky transformation in his head. Throughout it all, Tanya watched from the back of the room, her face glowing with pride. David caught her eye once and gave her a quick smile before returning to the problem. 20 minutes had passed since he'd first approached the board. The class period was drawing to a close, but no one made a move to pack up their things. Professor Thompson stood perfectly still, his eyes darting between David's calculations and his own notes. "And now," David said, writing the final lines of his solution, "if we substitute back into the original equation." He worked through the algebra carefully, simplifying as he went. "We get this result." He underlined the final expression twice and stepped back from the board. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft tapping of chalk as he set it down on the metal tray at the bottom of the blackboard. Professor Thompson stepped forward, examining the solution. His lips moved silently as he traced through David's work, checking each step, each transformation. The students waited, holding their collective breath. Finally, Thompson turned to face the class. "Mr. Wilson has provided us with an elegant solution to our problem." His voice held a note of surprise, perhaps even reluctant admiration. "Using an approach I must admit I hadn't considered." A wave of whispers swept through the room. Several students were taking photos of the board with their phones. Others were still frantically copying David's work into their notebooks. "The application of Chen's theorem was particularly inspired," Thompson continued, "as was the connection to Rodriguez and Park's recent findings." He turned to David. "May I ask where you received your mathematical training, Mr. Wilson?" "I have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Howard University," David replied. "But mathematics has always been a personal interest." "A personal interest," Thompson repeated as if testing the words. "Well, Mr. Wilson, your personal interest has led you to a solution that has eluded some of my graduate students for weeks." The bell rang, signaling the end of the period. No one moved. "That concludes our class for today," Professor Thompson announced. "For next time, please read chapters 7 and 8 with particular attention to the implications of what we've just witnessed." He turned to David. "Mr. Wilson, might I have a word with you before you go?" As the students began to pack up their things, many of them glanced at David with new eyes. A few nodded respectfully as they passed. One young woman stopped briefly. "That was amazing," she said quietly. "Are you sure you're just an engineer?" David smiled. "Engineers use a lot of math, too." After the last student had filed out, Tanya made her way down to the front of the room, her face split in a wide grin. "Dad, that was incredible. I knew you were good at math, but wow." "Thanks, kiddo," David said, feeling a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "I got lucky with a problem in my wheelhouse." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Professor Thompson interjected. "That was a masterful solution, Mr. Wilson." His tone had changed entirely, the earlier condescension replaced by genuine respect. "Your approach using Chen's theorem, I've never seen it applied that way to fluid dynamics problems." "It's something I've been thinking about for a while," David admitted. "I read a paper last year that suggested a possible connection, but it didn't fully develop the idea." "So you developed it yourself," Thompson said. "It wasn't a question." David shrugged modestly. "I like to work on problems in my free time." Professor Thompson shook his head in amazement. "Most people do crossword puzzles in their free time, Mr. Wilson. You're tackling unsolved problems in advanced mathematics." Tanya beamed at her father. "He's always been like this. You should see our kitchen table after dinner, just covered in papers with all these equations." "Is that right?" Thompson looked thoughtful. "Mr. Wilson, have you ever considered publishing your work?" David laughed softly. "Who would publish the mathematical musings of a power grid engineer?" "Any reputable journal in the field based on what I just witnessed," Thompson replied seriously. "Your insight into this problem suggests you may have valuable contributions to make to the field." David was taken aback by the shift in the professor's attitude. I've never really thought about it." "Well, perhaps you should." Thompson pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to David. "My email is on there. I'd be interested in seeing more of your work if you're willing to share it. David took the card, momentarily speechless. After years of solving mathematical problems in solitude, with no audience but himself, the idea of sharing his work with a Harvard professor was almost overwhelming. Thank you, he managed finally. I'll think about it. Please do, Thompson said. He hesitated, then added, and I owe you an apology, Mr. Wilson. I made assumptions when you walked into my classroom that were clearly unfounded. David nodded, accepting the apology without needing to dissect it. We all make judgments based on incomplete information, Professor. What matters is being willing to revise those judgments when new information comes along. Thompson smiled, genuinely this time. A philosophical engineer who solves complex mathematics problems for fun. You are full of surprises, Mr. Wilson. Tanya checked her watch. Dad, we're going to be late for the campus tour. Right, David said. We should go. Thank you for the unexpected opportunity, Professor. The pleasure was mine, Thompson replied. And Ms. Wilson, he added, turning to Tanya, based on what I've seen today, you come from excellent mathematical stock. I hope we'll see you at Harvard in a few years. Tanya's face lit up. That's the plan, sir. As they left the lecture hall, David felt a strange mix of emotions. There was pride, certainly, at having risen to the challenge. There was satisfaction in seeing his daughter's face glow with admiration. But there was something else, too, a reawakening of possibilities he had set aside years ago. Dad, that was the coolest thing ever, Tanya said as they hurried across the quad toward the admissions building where their tour would begin. Did you see their faces when you solved that equation? David laughed. I was too busy worrying about making a fool of myself. Are you kidding? You were amazing. Tanya's eyes sparkled with excitement. And now a Harvard professor wants to read your work. That's huge. It's flattering, David admitted. But let's focus on why we're really here. Your future, not mine. Tanya looped her arm through his. Maybe it's about both our futures now. As they joined the group of prospective students and their parents gathering for the campus tour, David found himself thinking about the card in his pocket and the dormant dreams it might reawaken. For years, he had set aside his own academic ambitions to focus on raising Tanya and providing her with opportunities he never had. He had never regretted that choice, not for a moment, but perhaps the time had come to reconsider what might still be possible. The tour guide began her well-rehearsed spiel about Harvard's rich history and tradition of excellence. David listened with half an ear, his mind still partly back in that lecture hall, still feeling the chalk between his fingers, still seeing the elegant mathematics unfold before him. Beside him, Tanya was hanging on the guide's every word, her face alight with dreams of her own. David squeezed her hand, filled with gratitude for this remarkable young woman who had just witnessed a part of him that few people ever saw, and who, instead of being embarrassed by her dad showing off, had beamed with pride. Whatever came next, this unexpected detour into Professor Thompson's classroom had already changed something fundamental. David had been seen, truly seen, not just as a father or an engineer, but as the mathematician he had always been in his heart. And in that recognition lay the seed of new possibilities, for both father and daughter. The campus tour ended as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Harvard Yard. David and Tanya thanked the tour guide and began walking toward the parking lot, discussing everything they'd learned about the university. But David could tell his daughter's mind was elsewhere. You're still thinking about what happened in that classroom, aren't you? He asked. Tanya nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. I can't stop thinking about it. The look on Professor Thompson's face when he realized you'd solved it. She shook her head in amazement. But Dad, there's something I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell me you were that good at math? I mean, I knew you helped me with my homework and stuff, but what you did in there was way beyond that. David sighed, watching a group of students lounging on the grass, their laughter carrying across the quad. How could he explain the choices he'd made, the dreams he'd set aside? It's complicated, sweetheart, he said finally. Let's grab something to eat before we head home, and I'll try to explain. They found a small cafe just off campus, the kind of place where students gathered to study, and professors held informal meetings over coffee. After ordering sandwiches, they settled at a corner table where they could talk privately. So, Tanya prompted, unwrapping her sandwich. Spill it, Dad. Were you secretly a math genius this whole time? David laughed softly. Hardly a genius. But yes, math was always special to me, the way music is to some people or art. It just made sense in a way other things didn't. Then why didn't you become a mathematician instead of an engineer? David took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. You know I grew up in West Philadelphia, right? My high school didn't have the best resources, but I had this incredible math teacher, Mr. Chen. He noticed I had some ability and started giving me extra problems, lending me books, like you do with me, Tanya said, making the connection. Exactly like that. By my senior year, Mr. Chen was convinced I could get a scholarship to college. He helped me apply to several schools, including some big names. Did you get in? I did. I got a full ride to MIT for mathematics. Tanya's eyes widened. MIT, Dad, that's amazing. But you went to Howard, right? For engineering, not math. David nodded, his expression growing more serious. I did. My mother got sick during my senior year, cancer. The treatments were expensive and she needed care. MIT was far away and the scholarship didn't cover everything. Howard offered me a full scholarship including housing, and it was closer to home. So you gave up MIT to help Grandma, Tanya said quietly. It wasn't really a choice, David replied. Family comes first. Always has, always will. And Howard is an excellent school. I switched to electrical engineering because the job prospects were better, and I knew I'd need to support Mom after graduation. Tanya was silent for a moment, absorbing this new information about her father's past. What happened after college? David smiled sadly. Life happened. I got my degree, got a good job with the power company, and took care of Mom until she passed. Then I met your mother, and 2 years later, we had you. His voice softened as memories washed over him. Those were good years, the three of us. Your mom was so proud of you, so sure you were going to do great things. I still miss her, Tanya said, her voice small. Me too, baby. Every day. They sat in silence for a moment, the ambient chatter of the cafe washing around them. After we lost her, David continued finally, everything changed. I was suddenly a single dad with an 8-year-old daughter. My focus became making sure you had everything you needed, a stable home, good schools, a normal life. My own interests, they just had to take a back seat. But you never stopped loving math, Tanya observed. David's face brightened. No, I never did. Those late nights at the kitchen table after you went to bed, that was my time. Just me and the problems that had been floating around in my head all day. Why didn't you ever try to do more with it? Go back to school, maybe? Timing, mostly. When would I have done that? Between work and raising you, there just weren't enough hours in the day. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. And I wouldn't trade a single minute of being your dad for anything. Tanya squeezed back, but her expression remained troubled. Still, it seems like you gave up a lot. I made choices, David corrected gently. Different choices might have led to a different life, but not necessarily a better one. I'm proud of the choices I made, even if it meant not becoming the mathematician you could have been. David considered this. I think I've always been a mathematician at heart, even if it's not on my business card. The way I see the world, the way I solve problems, that's all shaped by mathematics. I just found a different way to use those skills. Tanya took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. So what now? That professor seemed really impressed. He gave you his card. Professor Thompson? I don't know. It was an interesting moment, but nothing, Tanya interrupted. Dad, he wanted to see more of your work. That's huge, David shrugged. I'm not sure what would come of it. I'm 42 years old with no formal training in advanced mathematics beyond undergraduate courses I took 20 years ago. So, you just solved a problem that stumped his Harvard graduate students. I got lucky, David insisted. The problem happened to align with areas I've been reading about. Tanya rolled her eyes. Dad, stop. You're doing that thing Mom always called your humble routine. She said it used to drive her crazy. David laughed, caught off guard by the memory. She did say that, didn't she? David Wilson, one day your humility is going to smother your potential. Sounds like she was right, Tanya said with a triumphant smile. They finished their meal as the conversation shifted to other topics. Tanya's college applications, her upcoming science fair project, the novel she was currently reading, but David could tell the earlier revelation was still percolating in his daughter's mind. As they walked back to their car, Tanya said suddenly, I think you should email him. Professor Thompson? Yes, send him some of your work. What's the worst that could happen? He could realize I'm just an amateur with delusions of grandeur, David said dryly. Or, Tanya countered, he could help you get your work published. You said yourself that you've been working on these problems for years. Don't you want to know if you've discovered something important? David didn't answer immediately. The truth was there were several problems he'd made progress on over the years, approaches he'd developed that he'd never seen published. He'd always assumed that either his ideas weren't as novel as he thought, or that they weren't rigorous enough for academic standards. I'll think about it, he said finally. Tanya smiled, knowing she'd planted a seed. That's all I'm asking. The drive back to Philadelphia was filled with comfortable silence and occasional bursts of conversation. As they crossed the state line into Pennsylvania, Tanya asked, "Does anyone at work know about your math hobby?" David chuckled. Not really. I mean, they know I'm good with numbers. That's part of my job. But the theoretical stuff? No, that's just for me. What about your online forums? The ones you're always on late at night? Those are different, David explained. Online, no one knows I'm a power company engineer without a PhD. They just judge the ideas on their merit. What's your username? Tanya asked, suddenly curious. David hesitated, feeling oddly vulnerable. Math Whisperer 42, Tanya burst out laughing. Dad, that's so dorky. Hey, I came up with that before you were born. David protested, though he was laughing too. Besides, it fits. I've always felt like the math is already there, waiting. I'm just listening for it, trying to hear what it's saying. Tanya's laughter softened into a thoughtful smile. That's actually kind of beautiful. They drove in silence for a while, the highway unspooling before them. Your mother would be so proud of you, David said suddenly. The way you stood up for me today, the way you pushed me to see myself differently. She was like that too. Always believed in me more than I believed in myself. I think she'd be proud of both of us, Tanya replied softly. When they finally pulled into their driveway, it was nearly 11. The modest two-story house was dark except for the porch light David had left on that morning. It wasn't a fancy home, but it was theirs, filled with 16 years of memories. Get some sleep, David told Tanya as they went inside. You've got school tomorrow. What about you? Are you going to bed? David glanced toward the kitchen where his latest mathematical project was spread across the table, partially covered by a placemat to keep it safe from dinner spills. In a bit, he said. I want to look at something first. Tanya gave him a knowing look. You're going to email Professor Thompson, aren't you? Maybe. First, I want to review some of my notes. See if there's anything worth sharing. There is, Tanya said with absolute confidence. She kissed his cheek. Good night, Dad. Don't stay up too late solving the mysteries of the universe. After she went upstairs, David sat at the kitchen table and uncovered his notes. For the past few months, he'd been working on a problem related to energy distribution, networks, something that had started as a practical question at work but had evolved into a more abstract, mathematical inquiry. He'd developed an approach that combined elements of graph theory, differential equations, and optimization in a way he hadn't seen in the literature. Could it be valuable to others? Or was he just reinventing the wheel? David pulled out his laptop and began organizing his thoughts. He started typing an email to Professor Thompson, trying to find the right balance between confidence and humility. After several false starts, he settled on a straightforward approach. Professor Thompson, thank you for the opportunity to engage with your class today. I've attached some notes on a problem I've been working on that might interest you. It's related to optimization in complex distribution networks, with potential applications beyond power grids. I welcome your feedback should you have the time to review it. Regards, David Wilson. He attached a PDF of his most coherent notes. Double-checked the email for typos and then let his cursor hover over the send button. Was he really going to do this? Put his amateur mathematical musings before the eyes of a Harvard professor? From upstairs came the sound of Tanya's bedroom door closing. David thought about her face in that lecture hall, the pride in her eyes when he'd solved the problem, her unwavering belief in his abilities. He clicked send. For a moment, he sat staring at the screen, feeling a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. Then he closed the laptop and began gathering his papers. Whatever came of this, whether Professor Thompson responded with interest, polite dismissal, or nothing at all. David had taken a step toward acknowledging a part of himself he'd kept hidden for too long. As he climbed the stairs to bed, David paused at the framed family photo on the wall. Himself, his late wife, and a 7-year-old Tanya at the beach, all of them laughing at some forgotten joke. He touched his wife's face gently. "You'd get such a kick out of today," he whispered. "Our girl's going to Harvard just like we dreamed, and me? I'm finally listening to what you always said about not hiding my light." The next morning, David woke to the smell of coffee brewing. He found Tanya in the kitchen, already dressed for school and making breakfast. "You're up early," he observed, reaching for a mug. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "I kept thinking about yesterday. Did you email Professor Thompson?" David nodded. "Last night? Has he answered?" "I doubt he's even seen it yet." Professors are busy people. But when David checked his email after breakfast, there was already a reply from Thompson sent at 6:37 a.m. "David, your notes on distribution network optimization are fascinating, particularly your novel application of Riemann manifolds to the routing problem. I'd like to discuss this further. Are you available for a video call this week? This work has significant potential. Richard Thompson." David read the email twice, then handed his phone to Tanya. Her eyes widened as she read. "Dad, this is amazing." "It's just an initial response," David cautioned. "Don't get too excited." But Tanya was already dancing around the kitchen. "He said your work has significant potential. A Harvard professor." "I told you." Despite his attempts to temper her enthusiasm, David couldn't help feeling a surge of validation. Someone with real credentials had seen value in his work he'd done late at night at this very kitchen table. With no formal guidance, driven purely by his love of the subject. "I need to get to work," he said, glancing at the clock. "And you need to get to school." "Are you going to tell people at work?" Tanya asked. David considered this. "Not yet. Let's see where this goes first." As he drove to the power company offices, David found himself thinking about all the mathematical problems he'd explored over the years. The ones he'd solved, the ones he'd abandoned, the ones that still nagged at him during quiet moments. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine those explorations leading somewhere beyond his kitchen table, to publications, collaborations, a different kind of contribution to the field he loved. His phone buzzed with a calendar invitation from Professor Thompson for a video call the next evening. David accepted it, feeling a door opening to a future he had long ago set aside but never truly abandoned. At the office, David moved through his day with an unusual lightness. The routine tasks that occupied his working hours, analyzing grid performance data, troubleshooting system irregularities, attending planning meetings, all felt somehow connected to the mathematical mysteries he explored in his free time. It was all part of the same fabric, the same pursuit of patterns and solutions. His colleague Ray noticed the change at lunch. "What's up with you today, David? You seem, I don't know, different." David smiled. "Just had a good weekend with Tanya. Visited Harvard." "Harvard, huh? Your girl's aiming high." "She always has," David replied proudly. "And I think she's going to make it. With you as her dad?" "No doubt," Ray said. "The way you help all our kids with math homework at the company picnics?" "You should have been a teacher," David laughed. Maybe in another life, but as he said it, he wondered if perhaps this life still held possibilities he hadn't considered. If perhaps the line between the person he was and the person he might become was not as fixed as he had believed. That evening, after dinner, he showed Tanya his notes for the upcoming call with Professor Thompson. "What do you think?" he asked. "Too detailed?" "Not detailed enough." Tanya studied the pages with a seriousness that made her look older than her 16 years. "It's good, but you should explain this part more clearly," she said, pointing to a section of his derivation. "And maybe add an example here to show how it works in practice." David made the suggested changes, smiling at the role reversal. "When did you get so good at presenting mathematical ideas?" "I had a good teacher," Tanya replied, bumping her shoulder against his. As they worked together at the kitchen table, refining his presentation for Professor Thompson, David felt a deep sense of rightness. Whatever came next, whether this conversation led to publication, collaboration, or simply an interesting exchange of ideas, he had already received the most important validation he could ask for. the pride shining in his daughter's eyes as she watched her father embrace a part of himself he had kept hidden for too long. And in that moment, David understood that the choices he had made, to put family first, to find fulfillment in quiet, late-night explorations of mathematics, to build a life centered on his daughter's future, were not sacrifices at all. They were simply the unique path that had led him here, to this kitchen table, to this conversation with a Harvard professor, to this revelation of hidden talents that had been waiting patiently all along for their moment to shine. David sat at his kitchen table, laptop open, notes spread around him like fallen leaves. The clock on the microwave read 7:27 p.m., 3 minutes until his scheduled video call with Professor Thompson. His hands felt clammy as he shuffled his papers into a neater pile. "Dad, relax," Tanya said, placing a mug of tea beside him. "You've got this." I know," David replied, though his bouncing knee betrayed his nervousness. "It's just been a long time since I've had to defend my mathematical ideas to anyone but myself." "You're not defending anything," Tanya reminded him. "He reached out to you, remember? He's interested in your work." Before David could respond, his laptop chimed with an incoming call. He took a deep breath, smoothed down his shirt, and clicked accept. Professor Thompson's face appeared on the screen, his office bookshelves visible behind him.
"Ah, David, good evening."
"Thank you for making time for this conversation." "Thank you for your interest, Professor," David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Please, call me Richard. We're colleagues in this discussion." Thompson shifted in his chair, adjusting his glasses. "I've been reviewing your notes more thoroughly, and I must say, your approach to the distribution network problem is quite innovative." David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "I appreciate that. It's something I've been thinking about for several years, though I wasn't sure if my methods were rigorous enough for academic consideration." "Oh, they're rigorous," Thompson assured him. "Your mathematical instincts are sound. What's particularly interesting is how you've bridged theoretical concepts with practical applications. That's relatively rare in our field." "That probably comes from my engineering background," David explained. "In my work, mathematics always needs to connect back to physical systems." Thompson nodded. "Exactly. And that's what makes your perspective valuable. Pure mathematicians sometimes get lost in abstraction without considering real-world implications. Your approach brings both worlds together." For the next hour, they dove deep into David's work. Thompson asked probing questions, suggested alternative approaches, and occasionally offered gentle corrections. But mostly, he listened as David explained the insights that had come to him during those late-night sessions at his kitchen table. Tanya had retreated to the living room to give her father privacy, but David could see her peeking around the corner occasionally, giving him encouraging thumbs-up signs when Thompson seemed particularly impressed. "The central insight," David explained, pointing to a section of his notes that he held up to the camera, "is that when you reframe the distribution problem using modified tensor fields, patterns emerge that aren't visible in the standard approach." "Fascinating," Thompson murmured. "And you developed this framework independently?" "As far as I know," David said. "I mean, I've read widely in the field, but I haven't come across this specific approach in the literature." Thompson leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "David, what would you say to co-authoring a paper on this? Your work deserves to be published, and I believe it would make a significant contribution to the field." David blinked, certain he had misheard. "A paper? With you?" "Yes, your ideas, with perhaps some refinement in the formal presentation. I could help navigate the publication process, which can be daunting for newcomers. I'm not sure what to say," David stammered. "Say yes, Dad." Tanya's voice came from the living room, unable to contain her excitement any longer. Thompson laughed. "I see you have support for the idea." David grinned, embarrassed but pleased. "That's my daughter, Tanya. She's been my biggest cheerleader in all this." "Well, Tanya has good judgment," Thompson said. "What do you say?" David took a deep breath. "I'd be honored, Professor Richard. But I should be clear that I don't have formal training beyond my undergraduate degree. My approach might seem unorthodox to academic mathematicians." "Sometimes unorthodox is exactly what a field needs," Thompson replied. "Mathematics advances when people bring fresh perspectives. Your lack of formal training might actually be an advantage. You're not constrained by conventional thinking." They spent another half hour discussing next steps. with Thompson suggesting a timeline for drafting the paper and identifying potential journals for submission. By the time they ended the call, David felt as though he'd stepped into an alternate reality, one where his private mathematical explorations had suddenly become legitimate academic work. Tanya bounded into the kitchen as soon as he closed his laptop. "Well, tell me everything. I only heard bits and pieces." David's face broke into a wide smile. "We're going to write a paper together. A real academic paper for a mathematical journal." Tanya squealed and threw her arms around him. "I knew it. I knew your work was important." "This is huge, Dad." "It's just one paper," David cautioned, though he couldn't keep the excitement from his voice. "And there's a lot of work to do before it's ready for submission." "Still," Tanya insisted, "a Harvard professor thinks your math is publication-worthy." "That's amazing." David couldn't argue with that. For years, he had solved problems and developed theories with no audience but himself, never knowing if his ideas had value beyond the satisfaction they gave him. Now someone with credentials, someone whose life was devoted to mathematics, had validated his work in the most meaningful way possible. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. During the day, David continued his work at the power company, troubleshooting grid issues and attending meetings. But his evenings and weekends were now consumed by the paper. He and Professor Thompson, Richard as he now called him, exchanged drafts and ideas daily. Their collaboration quickly revealed their complementary strengths. David's intuitive approach and practical insights paired well with Richard's rigorous formalism and deep knowledge of the academic landscape. "You've developed a mathematical framework that could revolutionize how we think about resource distribution," Richard told him during one of their video calls. "Not just for power grids, but potentially for transportation networks, information systems, even biological processes." "You really think it has that kind of broad application?" David asked, still adjusting to the idea that his kitchen table mathematics might have real-world impact. "Absolutely. The beauty of your approach is its scalability across different domains. That's what makes great mathematics, when the abstraction captures something fundamental about how systems work." One evening, as David was working through a particularly tricky section of the paper, Tanya sat down across from him at the kitchen table with her calculus homework. "How's it going?" she asked, nodding toward his laptop. "Good, I think. Richard's suggestions have really strengthened the theoretical foundation. But I'm stuck on how to explain this concept without getting too technical." He pushed his notes toward her. "What do you think? Does this make sense to you?" Tanya studied the page, her brow furrowed in concentration. After a moment, she looked up. "I think I get it, but you're using a lot of jargon. What if you started with a simple example, then built up to the complex case?" David considered this. "That's not a bad idea. A concrete example might make it more accessible." "That's how you always explain math to me," Tanya pointed out. "You start with something I can visualize, then add the complications step by step." "You're right," David said, already sketching a new approach to the section. "Sometimes I forget that not everyone sees the patterns as immediately as I do." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the scratching of pencils and the occasional tapping of computer keys. "Dad," Tanya said eventually, "I'm really proud of you." David looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For this," she gestured at his notes. "For not giving up on your dreams, even when life took you in a different direction. For showing me that it's never too late to pursue what you love." David felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot. Mom would be proud too," Tanya added softly. "Yeah," David agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "She always did tell me I shouldn't hide my light under a bushel." The following Saturday morning, David's phone rang as he was making breakfast. It was Richard, sounding unusually excited. "David, I've just had a conversation with the editor of the Journal of Applied Mathematics. I sent him a brief overview of our work, and he's very interested. If we can submit the full paper within the next 2 weeks, he'll fast-track it for review." David nearly dropped the spatula he was holding. 2 weeks? That's pretty soon. I know it's tight, but this is a golden opportunity. This journal typically has a 6-month backlog, but they're preparing a special issue on innovative approaches to complex systems, and our paper would be a perfect fit. "Then we'll make it happen," David said firmly, already mentally rearranging his schedule for the coming days. When he told Tanya about the accelerated timeline, She immediately offered to help. I can proofread or help with the bibliography or whatever you need. Don't you have your own schoolwork to worry about? David asked. Tanya waved this away. This is more important. Besides, I'm ahead in most of my classes anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, their home transformed into a mathematical workshop. The kitchen table disappeared under stacks of papers, reference books borrowed from the local university library, and printouts of related articles. David took a few days off work to focus on completing the paper, working late into the night with Richard via video calls that often stretched past midnight. Tanya became an integral part of the process, offering insights on clarity and presentation that proved invaluable. She even created the visualizations for the paper, applying her computer graphic skills to render David's mathematical concepts into elegant, intuitive diagrams. These are excellent, Richard said when he saw her work. They communicate the concepts far more effectively than standard mathematical notation alone. The night before the submission deadline, David, Richard, and Tanya held a final review session via video call. They had been working on the paper for nearly 6 hours straight, refining language, checking references, and ensuring that every equation was correct and every claim properly supported. I think we're done, Richard said finally, his voice hoarse from hours of discussion. Unless either of you sees anything else that needs addressing? David scanned through the document one last time. It looks solid to me. Me too, Tanya agreed, stifling a yawn. It was nearly 2 a.m. and she had school the next day, but she had insisted on staying up for the final review. Then I believe we have a completed paper, Richard declared. David, would you like to do the honors of submitting it? David hesitated. Are you sure? You're the one with the academic credentials. But it's your mathematical insight at the heart of this work, Richard countered. It seems fitting that you should be the one to send it out into the world. With Tanya looking over his shoulder, David navigated to the journal's submission portal, uploaded their carefully prepared files, filled out the required forms, and finally clicked the Submit button. For a moment, all three of them stared at the confirmation page in silence. We did it, David said at last. Indeed we did, Richard replied. Now comes the hardest part, waiting for the reviewer's feedback. How long will that take? Tanya asked. Typically a few months, but since this is being fast-tracked, perhaps only a few weeks. Either way, David, you should be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. After they ended the call, David sat quietly at the kitchen table, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. 6 weeks ago, he had been an electrical engineer who solved mathematical problems as a private hobby. Now he was the co-author of a paper submitted to one of the most respected journals in applied mathematics. You okay, Dad? Tanya asked, putting a hand on his shoulder. Yeah, he said, covering her hand with his own. Just taking it all in. This isn't how I expected my life to go at 42. Life doesn't always follow a straight line, Tanya said, repeating a phrase David himself had often used when talking about her mother's death and the unexpected turns their family had taken. David smiled at hearing his own wisdom echoed back to him. You're right about that. Now go get some sleep, you've got school tomorrow. What about you? I'll be up in a bit. Just want to sit here and think for a while. After Tanya went upstairs, David made himself a cup of tea and sat at the table where he had spent so many hours pursuing his private passion for mathematics. The house was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of settling floors and the distant hum of the refrigerator. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this point, the young boy from West Philadelphia who had fallen in love with the elegant patterns of mathematics, the college student who had set aside dreams of MIT to care for his mother, the young husband and father building a life based on practical choices rather than academic ambitions, the single dad working to give his daughter every opportunity he could, and now, this new identity emerging, a contributor to mathematical knowledge, a researcher whose work might actually matter. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself as a young man. In some ways it was harder and marked by loss. In other ways it was richer and more complex than anything he could have planned. But sitting there in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of these past intense weeks of collaboration, David felt a deep sense of gratitude for the winding path that had led him here. 3 weeks later, David was in the middle of a meeting at work when his phone buzzed with a text from Richard. The reviews are in. Call me when you can. For the remaining hour of the meeting, David could barely focus on the discussion about grid maintenance schedules. As soon as it ended, he found an empty conference room and called Richard. "What did they say?" he asked without preamble. "They've accepted it," Richard replied, his voice filled with satisfaction, "with only minor revisions. The reviewers were quite impressed. One called it a breakthrough approach with significant implications for multiple fields." David sank into a chair, his legs suddenly weak. "They accepted it. Just like that. Just like that. Though I'm not entirely surprised. The work stands on its own merits, David. This isn't charity or favoritism. Your mathematical insights are genuinely valuable. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything. But there is something else we should discuss." Richard's tone shifted slightly. "Based on this paper's reception, I think we should consider a follow-up. Perhaps expanding the application to other domains, as we've discussed." "Another paper?" David asked, still trying to process the acceptance of the first one. "Actually, I was thinking of something more substantial. What would you say to collaborating on a book? Network distribution theory, a new mathematical framework. We could expand the concepts from the paper, explore applications across various fields." David stared at the blank conference room wall, feeling as though he had stepped into someone else's life. "A book, Richard, I don't know if I'm qualified." "I'd stop that," Richard interrupted firmly. "If these past weeks have shown anything, it's that you are more than qualified. You've spent years developing these ideas without institutional support or academic resources. Imagine what you could accomplish with those advantages. What are you suggesting?" There was a brief pause before Richard continued. "Harvard has a visiting scholar program. It's typically for academics from other institutions, but exceptions can be made for individuals with demonstrated contributions to their field. You want me to come to Harvard as a visiting scholar? Only if you're interested. It would be part-time, of course. I understand you have a job and a daughter to consider. But it would give you access to our resources, opportunities to collaborate with other mathematicians, perhaps even some teaching experiences if you're inclined." David's mind raced. "I'd have to talk to my boss, figure out if I could reduce my hours or maybe take a sabbatical. And Tanya would be thrilled," Richard guessed. "And from what you've told me about her academic ambitions, having a father affiliated with Harvard might not be a bad thing when she applies." David couldn't help but laugh. "You fight dirty, Richard, using my daughter's college prospects to persuade me." "I use whatever arguments are at my disposal," Richard replied, unrepentant. "Think about it. No need to decide immediately. For now, let's focus on the revisions for the paper and getting it ready for publication." After they hung up, David sat in the conference room for a long time, staring out the window at the Philadelphia skyline. The path that had begun with that unexpected challenge in a Harvard classroom was now branching in directions he had never anticipated. Published mathematician, potential author, visiting scholar at Harvard. None of these had been part of his life plan. But then life rarely followed the paths we laid out for it. Sometimes the most important journeys began with a single step taken on impulse, like walking into a mathematics classroom with his daughter on an autumn afternoon. When he got home that evening, David found Tanya already at the kitchen table, working on a physics assignment. She looked up as he entered, her expression immediately alert. "What is it?" she asked. "Something happened. I can tell from your face." David set down his bag and jacket. "The paper was accepted. It's going to be published." Tanya leaped from her chair, her physics homework forgotten. "Oh my God, Dad. That's amazing." She threw her arms around him in a fierce hug. "I knew it. I told you your work was important." "You did," David acknowledged, holding her tight. "You believed in me even when I didn't fully believe in myself. So what happens now?" Tanya asked, stepping back but keeping her hands on his arms as if afraid he might float away with this news. "Well, we need to make some minor revisions based on the reviewer's feedback. And then—" He paused, still processing the other part of his conversation with Richard. "Richard has suggested I consider becoming a visiting scholar at Harvard. Part-time, of course." Tanya's eyes widened to an almost comical degree. "Are you serious?" "Dad, that's incredible." "It's just an idea at this point," David cautioned. "There are a lot of details to work out, my job here, our home." "But you're considering it, right?" Tanya pressed. "You're not going to just dismiss it?" David looked at his daughter. at the hope and excitement shining in her eyes, at the fierce belief she had in his abilities, and felt a surge of certainty. "Yes," he said. "I'm considering it. Actually, I'm more than considering it. I think I want to do it." Tanya squeezed his arms. "Good, because if you didn't, I was going to have to give you a very long lecture about not wasting opportunities." David laughed. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from the best," Tanya replied simply. As they stood there in their kitchen, the very place where David had spent countless hours pursuing his private passion for mathematics, he felt a sense of completion. The equation of his life, with all its variables and unexpected turns, was revealing its elegant solution. Not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter, whatever came next, whether it was Harvard lectures or published papers or simply the quiet satisfaction of knowing his work had value. David knew that he had already received the most precious validation of all, the pride in his daughter's eyes as she watched him step fully into the person he had always been beneath the surface. The mathematician had always been there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now, thanks to an unexpected challenge and the unwavering support of a 16-year-old girl who never doubted him, that moment had finally arrived. The spring sunshine streamed through the tall windows of Harvard's mathematics department as David Wilson stood at the podium, looking out at the filled lecture hall. His hands weren't shaking anymore, not like they had been 6 months ago when he'd given his first talk as a visiting scholar. Now, as he prepared to present the latest developments in his work, he felt a quiet confidence that still surprised him. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began. "Today we'll be discussing extensions to the Wilson-Thomson distribution framework and its applications to quantum information networks." From the front row, Richard Thompson gave him an encouraging nod. Beside Richard sat Tanya, who had skipped her Friday classes to drive up from Philadelphia with David for this special presentation. At 17, she looked more grown-up than ever in her navy blazer and silver earrings that had belonged to her mother. The audience was a mix of mathematics faculty, graduate students, visiting researchers, and even a few undergraduates who had heard about the innovative work coming from this unexpected collaboration between a Harvard professor and a power grid engineer. In the back row, David spotted his boss from Philadelphia, who had made the trip to see his employee's academic presentation. The support from his workplace had been surprising and heartwarming. They had arranged a flexible schedule that allowed David to spend every other week at Harvard while continuing his engineering work. "As many of you know," David continued, "our initial paper in the Journal of Applied Mathematics introduced a new mathematical framework for optimizing distribution across complex networks." He advanced to the first slide, showing the elegant equations that had once existed only in his notebooks. What began as an approach to power grid optimization has proven applicable across numerous domains. As David moved through his presentation, explaining the mathematical principles with a clarity that came from years of thinking deeply about these concepts, he couldn't help reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. 1 year ago, he had been an electrical engineer who solved theoretical mathematics problems at his kitchen table for personal satisfaction. Now he was giving invited talks at Harvard, co-authoring papers with leading mathematicians, and preparing to teach a graduate seminar in the fall, all because he had walked into a classroom with his daughter on what should have been a routine campus visit. "The beauty of this approach," David explained, highlighting a particularly elegant formula, "is how it reveals hidden symmetries in apparently disparate systems. Whether we're talking about electrical power distribution, information flow in neural networks, or resource allocation in economic systems, these underlying patterns emerge consistently." A student raised her hand with a thoughtful question about boundary conditions. David answered it confidently, drawing on both his theoretical understanding and his practical experience with real-world systems. This blend of perspectives had become his signature contribution, bridging the gap between abstract mathematics and applied engineering in ways that enriched both fields. After the presentation ended, David was surrounded by faculty and students eager to discuss potential applications of his work to their own research. Richard watched from a few feet away, a satisfied smile on his face. When the crowd finally thinned, he approached David with Tanya. "Excellent presentation," Richard said, clasping David's shoulder. You've come a long way from that first day in my classroom. All thanks to your willingness to take a chance on an unknown engineer, David replied. Richard shook his head. I simply recognized talent when I saw it. You did all the hard work. We all did, David corrected, including Tanya in his glance. This has been a team effort from the beginning. Indeed, Tanya had become an unofficial contributor to their work, offering insights from her fresh perspective and creating visualizations that made complex concepts more accessible. Her college applications were due in a few months, and her personal essay focused on how watching her father's mathematical journey had shaped her own aspirations. As they left the mathematics building, David's boss caught up with them. David, that was impressive stuff, he said, shaking David's hand firmly. I understood maybe half of it, but what I did understand convinced me we're lucky to still have you on our team. Thanks, Mike, David replied. I appreciate you making the trip. Wouldn't have missed it. And the company is getting quite a bit of positive press from your academic work. The board is very pleased with the arrangement. The flexible schedule had been Mike's idea, allowing David to split his time between his engineering work and his new academic pursuits. It hadn't been entirely selfless. Having an employee publishing groundbreaking mathematical papers with Harvard brought prestige to the company and had already led to several innovative improvements in their power grid management systems. Actually, Mike added, that's partly why I came. The board has approved a new position they want to discuss with you. Director of Advanced Research. You'd head up a small team developing next-generation grid optimization techniques based on your mathematical work. Less day-to-day engineering, more research and development. David blinked in surprise. That sounds intriguing. Think about it. We can discuss details when you're back in Philly next week. For now, enjoy your moment in the academic spotlight. Mike nodded to Tanya and Richard. Nice to see you both again. After Mike left, the three of them walked across Harvard Yard, enjoying the spring afternoon. Students lounged on the grass, some studying, others simply soaking up the sunshine. A year ago, David had walked these same paths as an outsider, a parent accompanying his daughter on a campus visit. Now professors and students greeted him by name as they passed. So, Richard said as they found a bench near the library, what do you think of Mike's offer? David considered the question. It's appealing. It would allow me to apply our theoretical work directly to real-world systems. While maintaining your connection to Harvard, Richard added, the visiting scholar position is renewable indefinitely, as long as you continue to contribute to the field. And the book? Tanya asked. She had been deeply involved in the planning for the textbook David and Richard were writing, even contributing a chapter on visual representations of complex network theories. The book continues either way, Richard assured her. Cambridge University Press is already excited about it. David shook his head in amazement. Sometimes I still can't believe any of this is happening. Believe it, Tanya said firmly. You earned this, Dad. All those nights at the kitchen table, all those mathematical problems you solved just because you loved the challenge. It was leading here all along. David smiled at his daughter, marveling at her wisdom and her faith in him. Maybe you're right. Though I never imagined here would include Harvard lectures and book contracts. Life has a way of surprising us, Richard observed. Speaking of which, there's something else I wanted to discuss with both of you. David and Tanya looked at him expectantly. The department is establishing a new scholarship for underrepresented students in mathematics, Richard explained. The faculty committee has voted to name it the Wilson Innovation Scholarship. David stared at him. After me? Your story has resonated deeply here, David. A brilliant mathematical mind who didn't follow the traditional academic path, but found his way back to the field through perseverance and passion. The scholarship will support students who demonstrate exceptional mathematical creativity, particularly those from backgrounds not typically represented in advanced mathematics. David felt a lump forming in his throat. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Richard suggested. And perhaps consider serving on the selection committee. Your perspective would be invaluable in identifying unconventional talent. Tanya squeezed her father's arm. Dad, this is incredible. Think about how many students this could help. Students like you who might otherwise never get the chance to pursue mathematics at this level. David nodded, too moved to speak for a moment. When he'd walked into Richard's classroom that day, challenged by a professor who saw only an uninformed parent, He couldn't have imagined that his name would one day be attached to a Harvard scholarship, that his work would be published in prestigious journals, that he would stand at a podium in that same building, presenting his own mathematical discoveries to an attentive audience. "I'd be honored," he said finally, "both to accept the naming and to serve on the committee." Richard smiled. "Excellent. Now I believe we have dinner reservations to celebrate your successful presentation." As they walked toward the restaurant, David's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the Journal of Network Theory, confirming acceptance of their latest paper, the third in what was becoming a significant body of work. "Good news?" Tanya asked, noticing his smile. "The network theory paper was accepted," David told her. "They want to feature it in their special issue on emerging frameworks." "That's the third one this year," Tanya exclaimed. "You're on a roll, Dad." "We're on a roll," David corrected, including both her and Richard in his glance. "None of this would have happened without either of you." At the restaurant, they were seated at a corner table with a view of the Charles River. As they settled in with menus, a distinguished-looking man approached their table. "Richard, I thought that was you," the man said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Richard stood to shake the man's hand. "Not at all. David, Tanya, this is Dean Horvath from the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. William, this is David Wilson, our visiting scholar I've told you about, and his daughter Tanya." The dean shook David's hand warmly. "The power grid mathematician. Your work has created quite a buzz across departments. We don't often see papers that bridge pure theory and practical applications so seamlessly." "Thank you," David replied, still not entirely comfortable with such praise from academic leaders. "I've had excellent collaborators." "Richard mentioned you're considering teaching a graduate seminar in the fall?" the dean inquired. "That's the plan. Mathematical frameworks for complex networks, aimed at both mathematics and engineering students." Dean Horvath nodded approvingly. "Excellent. We need more cross-disciplinary thinking. In fact, I'd like to discuss the possibility of joint appointments between departments for scholars like yourself who work at these intersections." He glanced at Richard. "Perhaps we could meet next week to explore the idea further." After the dean left, Richard leaned forward. "A joint appointment would be unusual for a visiting scholar, but not unprecedented. It would give you access to resources in both departments." David shook his head in amazement. "A year ago, I was explaining basic circuit theory to junior engineers. Now deans want to meet about joint appointments." "Because your work matters," Richard said simply. "It's opening new pathways for both fields." As they enjoyed their dinner, the conversation shifted to Tanya's college plans. She had applied to several top schools, including Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. "Decision letters should arrive next month," she said, trying to sound casual, though David could hear the underlying tension in her voice. "Whichever school you choose will be lucky to have you," he assured her. Tanya smiled. "I'm just glad we'll be in the same city if I end up at Harvard. Though it might be weird having my dad teaching on campus." "I promise not to embarrass you," David said solemnly, then grinned. "At least not intentionally." As they finished their meal, Richard raised his glass. "To new beginnings, unexpected journeys, and the power of a well-timed mathematical challenge." They clinked glasses, and David felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. The path that had led him here had been neither straight nor predictable. It had been marked by loss, by pragmatic choices that deferred dreams, by quiet midnight hours at a kitchen table covered in equations. But it had also been marked by love for his late wife, for his remarkable daughter, for the elegant patterns of mathematics that had always spoken to his soul. The following morning, before heading back to Philadelphia, David and Tanya took a detour to the cemetery where David's mother was buried. They placed fresh flowers on her grave, standing together in the peaceful quiet. "She would be so proud of you," Tanya said softly. "Of both of us," David replied, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "She always said education was the key that no one could ever take away from you. Do you think Mom would be proud too?" David closed his eyes briefly, picturing his wife's smile, her unwavering belief in him. "I know she would. She used to tell me I had mathematician hands, whatever that means." Tanya laughed. "Sounds like something she would say." They stood in silence for a moment longer before walking back to the car. As they drove home, Tanya worked on her calculus homework while David's mind wandered to the seminar he would be teaching in the fall. He was already planning how to make complex mathematical concepts accessible to students from different backgrounds, just as he had done for Tanya over the years. 6 weeks later, David was at his desk at the power company when his phone buzzed with a text from Tanya. "It's here." He immediately knew what she meant. He'd been checking the mail anxiously every day, knowing that college decision letters were due to arrive. He called her right away. "Did you open it?" he asked without preamble. "Not yet," Tanya replied, her voice tense with excitement. "I wanted to wait for you to get home, but I don't think I can hold out that long." "Then don't," David said, smiling into the phone. "Open it now. I'll stay on the line." He heard the sound of tearing paper, then a moment of silence that seemed to stretch forever. "Dad?" Tanya's voice was barely a whisper. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I got in. To Harvard. Full scholarship." David closed his eyes, overcome with emotion. "The Wilson Innovation Scholarship?" "No, different one. The Faculty Honors Scholarship." Her voice grew stronger with excitement. "Dad, they mentioned my contributions to your papers in the acceptance letter. They know about the visualizations I created." "Of course they do," David said, pride swelling in his chest. "Richard probably made sure of that. You earned this, Tanya. Every bit of it." That evening, they celebrated with takeout from Tanya's favorite restaurant, sitting at the same kitchen table where both their mathematical journeys had unfolded. David had brought home a small gift, a beautiful notebook with a cover that showed the night sky filled with mathematical equations that formed constellations. "For your Harvard ideas," he said as she unwrapped it. Tanya ran her fingers over the cover. "It's perfect." She looked up at him, her eyes suddenly serious. "Are you okay with this? With me going to Harvard? I know it means leaving you here alone." David smiled gently. "I won't be alone. I'll be at Harvard every other week with my visiting scholar position. And with this new director role Mike offered, I'll have more flexibility to travel." He reached across the table to take her hand. "Besides, this is exactly what we've been working toward all these years. You having every opportunity to pursue your dreams." "Our dreams," Tanya corrected. "Both of us." That fall, as leaves once again turned golden across Harvard Yard, David stood at the front of a packed lecture hall, welcoming students to his graduate seminar. In the third row, Tanya sat among the other freshmen who had been granted special permission to take this advanced course. She gave him a subtle thumbs up as he began his lecture. "Mathematics reveals the hidden structures that govern our world." David began. "Whether we're talking about power grids, information networks, or social systems, certain patterns emerge consistently. In this course, we'll explore those patterns and develop frameworks for understanding them." As he spoke, David thought about the pattern of his own life, how moments of challenge and choice had created a structure he could never have predicted, but which now seemed, in retrospect, to have its own mathematical elegance. The father who had once stood nervously at a blackboard, faced with an unexpected challenge, was now Professor Wilson, teaching the very frameworks that had emerged from that moment. Life, like mathematics, was full of unexpected solutions. Sometimes the most beautiful equations were those you never set out to solve. After class, David and Tanya walked across campus together, a father and daughter who had found their paths converging in ways neither could have imagined on that first campus visit, 2 years earlier. "How did it feel?" Tanya asked. "Teaching your first official class here?" David considered the question. "It felt like coming home to a place I never knew I belonged." Tanya smiled, understanding perfectly. "That's how I feel too." As they passed the building where it had all begun, where a professor had challenged a visitor and received an unexpected solution, David paused to look up at its windows. So much had changed because of what had happened inside those walls. A hidden talent revealed, a new path discovered, a legacy established that would open doors for others. "You know what Mom used to say?" Tanya remarked, following his gaze. "Sometimes you have to get lost to find where you're supposed to be." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. She was right about that. As she was about so many things, they continued walking, a comfortable silence between them. Ahead lay new challenges, new equations to solve, new frameworks to discover.